Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about the 5 endogenous defense mechanisms for SIBO. Now all this really means is there are at least 5 things that we really want to be mindful about when we've been diagnosed with SIBO, because the theory goes that one of these things has to have been compromised for you to be able to develop SIBO. Hence these are endogenous, internal defense mechanisms. They are things that protect us from SIBO occurring. So we're going to break this down. We're going to look at each one and expand on it a little bit as well. So starting at the top, we need to think about our stomach acid. Now, as you know, the stomach is an incredibly acidic environment. Often on the pH scale, it's between 1 and 3, certainly in between meals. The pH will increase at meal times when all that food enters the stomach. But certainly, in a fasted state, let's say, it's between 1 and 3. And that acidity has different roles to play, but one of them is to kill various microorganisms that we might get exposed to in our food and also in our water supply potentially, but also just in our environment. If you're kissing your dog, for example, your stomach acid might be killing off some of the organisms that you get exposed to. Now, one of the reasons why this is so important is because that stomach acid is contributing to optimal digestive function further down the digestive system. So we need appropriate stomach acid for us to have good digestion from a small intestine perspective. And what we're referring to here, for example, is the production of digestive enzymes and juices from our pancreas, and also the production of bile or the release of bile from our gallbladder. Both have important roles to play within preventing SIBO in their own right. Stomach acid doesn't just kill bacteria or organisms, it doesn't just contribute to optimal digestion from a pancreatic and liver gallbladder perspective, but it also is important when we think about our oral microbiome, the bacteria that reside within our mouth. There is some research that shows us that an imbalance in the oral microbiome can contribute to small intestine bacterial overgrowth and actually can contribute to inflammatory bowel disease. That defense mechanism, the stomach and that stomach acidity, is one of the things that should also kill off certain bacteria that we're going to be swallowing in our saliva. Now, low stomach acid, so compromised stomach acid if we call it that, in my experience is quite a common scenario in clinical practice for those struggling with chronic digestive issues and also chronic fatigue. Something that I only learned this year, 2024, is that the parietal cells that are involved in stomach acid production have the most mitochondria compared to any other cell in the human body. And many of you will know that your mitochondria are really the site of energy production in the cell. So we could speculate that if we have the most abundant of mitochondria in these parietal cells, then perhaps producing stomach acid is a very energy dependent process. And might this explain, or at least partly explain, why a lot of people with chronic fatigue issues also have chronic gut issues. So we want to be mindful that for some people struggling with chronic gut issues and chronic fatigue issues, that actually we might need to see improvement in energy production at a cellular level before we're going to be able to improve and optimize the digestive system and digestive function. So number 1, stomach acid we have to think about. The second thing we need to think about is bile. Bile is produced in the liver, it's stored in the gallbladder, and bile is squirted into your small intestine at mealtime, partly to help you digest the fats within that meal. So if you eat a fatty meal, and that's when you notice your symptoms really are at their worst, you feel some nausea or you get reflux or whatever it may be, bloating, you just feel heavy and off, it could be that there is an issue with the biliary system and bile production or bile flow. But bile doesn't just help you digest your fats, it also has antimicrobial properties and motility properties. And obviously, therefore, bile has a really important role to play within SIBO because it has antibacterial properties. It can help manage the microbiome that is within the small intestine, and it can help the passage of the food through the small intestine as well. Bile can be compromised as a result of energy deficit states, so chronic fatigue type issues. It can also be impacted by thyroid function, and this takes us maybe into the third endogenous defense mechanism, which is motility. So motility is the rate at which food is traveling through the stomach and small intestine. And many will argue that this is arguably the most common underlying cause of small intestine bacterial overgrowth. So we've just mentioned that bile helps with motility, but thyroid hormones help with motility as well. And in fact, there are certain bacteria that can help with motility, and there are certain bacterial metabolites that can either help or hinder motility. For example, butyrate, certainly in the large intestine, can support motility. Butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid produced by various bacteria, but we do know that there are butyrate receptors in the small intestine, and therefore, again, we might speculate that butyrate has some role to play within motility, perhaps in the small intestine too. Now, it's also probably worth just highlighting the significant role that stress can play within motility. If we are chronically stressed, then we are not going to have optimal motility. And this is such a big factor, I feel, in people dealing with chronic gut issues. And it's a real vicious cycle whereby some of the stress and perhaps even anxiety that we might be experiencing is coming from the fact that we have chronic gut issues and we don't seem to be able to understand or get on top of the symptoms that are that we're suffering with ultimately. So I totally get that this is a really tricky situation sometimes, but it is a situation that has to be addressed, and that requires a little bit of inquiry. It requires a little bit of compassion and sort of nurturing and holding ourselves in a safe space to inquire around the stress that we might be experiencing at this point in time. One thing I will say, and this is based on research, we're really good at lying to ourselves, if I put it really basically and a bit bluntly. And there's a quote that I always forget, but the message is that the mind lies, the body never does. So if you look at certain biomarkers, that will tell you if you are in a state of fight or flight or functional freeze, for example. We can look at things like cortisol and adrenaline, but we can also look at heart rate variability. And I have a little video that I'm going to add on shortly from an interview I did with the brilliant Marek Doyle, where he talked about heart rate variability as a very powerful biomarker that you can monitor using either apps on your smartphone or using wearables, as they call them, such as the Whoop band or the Oura ring that I have as an example here. And your heart rate variability is going to give you a very accurate analysis of what state your nervous system is in, and are you in a mobilized fight or flight stress response, or are you in a healthy, well-regulated response, or actually could you be in a state of kind of functional freeze, as they call it. So there are some really important markers here that we have to be thinking about. Then, moving away from motility, we can also think about the ileocecal valve. This I often describe as the trap door between the small and the large intestine. The ileocecal valve can be dysfunctional, and this can allow a migration of bacteria up from the large intestine into the small intestine, contributing to what we might call distal small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Distal just referring to the fact that the overgrowth is in sort of the second half, the end of the small intestine, rather than higher up. Ileocecal valve is, my understanding, is largely under control from the autonomic nervous system. If you wanted to sort of have it checked, if it was dysfunctioning and you needed to manipulate it, that is where seeing a physical therapist, someone like a physio or an osteopath, is appropriate. I refer people to the Bile Institute, and I'll put links to all of these things in the notes below. The Bile Institute train these sorts of therapists in myofascial release, and they will all be able to look into this side of things for you. The final endogenous defense mechanism that is talked about in the research is really the immune system within the small intestine. You know, we're producing various things like secretory IgA and other antimicrobial compounds and immune modulating compounds that can help maintain a healthy microbial load within the small intestine. And again, if this is compromised, it might contribute to the development of small intestine bacterial overgrowth. So those are the 5 endogenous defense mechanisms that are discussed in the SIBO literature. But I've added, in some ways, at least one other one, which is kind of our nervous system and that stress response, which has such a prominent role to play within this. It's worth now just highlighting some of the things we might need to consider if one of these 5 defense mechanisms is compromised. So obviously, if we're thinking that we have low stomach acid, then we can consider supplementing some betaine hydrochloride. This is a way of simply replacing what we are lacking to some degree to ensure that you are killing off those bacteria that you're being exposed to, either from the oral microbiome or from the things that you are eating and drinking. But it is also optimizing the digestive process. And the digestive process, as we sort of touched on previously, is like a line of dominoes. And if you don't have good digestion starting in the stomach, you cannot have optimal digestion within the small intestine. So we have to treat north to south, as Dr. Karazian describes in his teachings. From a small intestine digestion perspective, we can think about pancreatic enzyme therapy to support the digestion of our foods. And we can also think about things like bitters as a way to help the production and the flow of bile to ensure that we are digesting primarily our fats when we think of bile. Pancreatic enzymes will help digest the 3 macronutrients, your proteins, your fats, and your carbohydrates to some degree. Now, someone who is in a chronic state of stress for whatever reason may need to do all 3 of these things for a period of time while they address the true underlying imbalances which is inhibiting their innate production of these digestive enzymes and juices. From a motility perspective, we again really need to think about what's causing the poor motility. Is there a thyroid issue? Is there again issues from a nervous system, stress, resources perspective? But we can consider the products on the market that support motility. A lot of these products would include things like a little bit of 5-HTP, some ginger, a little bit of vitamin B6, among potentially some herbs as well that can support transit, can support the rate at which food is traveling through your intestine. A very simple test is a little bit crude, but it can be very helpful for some. To understand your transit time is to eat some sweet corn, buy yourself a can of sweet corn rather than corn on the cob, swallow individual pieces so you're not actually chewing it, and keep an eye on your bowel movements. When is it that you see the sweet corn coming out, and when is the last bit of sweet corn that you see coming out? That really should be something like a 16 to 24-hour process. If you're seeing sweet corn 2 days later, 3, 4, 5, 6 days later, then there is a significant motility issue that would have to be addressed for you to really have any chance of optimizing digestive health. In regards to the ileocecal valve, we already touched on this. That would require some kind of manual physical therapist. And I mentioned the Bile Institute. There'll be a link below where you can put in your postcode and you'll be able to search for your most local Bile Institute certified practitioner. You could also just call your local physio or osteopath and just ask them, is this something that you would be able to look at for me? And then from an immune system perspective, this is a little bit more of a tricky one because there's no direct obvious research that I've seen around this, but we might start thinking about the use of certain probiotics ranging from Saccharomyces boulardii through to lactobacillus and bifido products, or some of the spore-based probiotics. Some of you will know that Dr. Ruscio talks about triple probiotic therapy to treat SIBO, talking about each of these types of probiotic, i.e. Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a yeast strain probiotic, a blend of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium strains of a probiotic, and then spore-based probiotics. For some, that can be a really effective strategy. So those are some of the things that we need to be thinking about when we have been diagnosed with small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And to be fair, things that we need to be thinking about if we just have chronic digestive issues, because these are the foundations of optimal gut health. Now, I just want to share with you a couple of clips from 2 previous interviews to sort of allow other people to put this within their own context. The first one is with Marek Doyle about the importance of understanding your heart rate variability. And I mentioned there are apps like HRV for training that you can download onto your phone for free. And then there's technology that you can use, from watches to the Whoop bands and the Oura Ring, that can be really helpful here as well. It would be even more helpful to work with a practitioner who really understands heart rate variability so they can support you with the data that you're kind of accumulating from it. The second video is with Elliot Overton, who's been on the podcast, talking about the importance for a small percentage of people with chronic gut issues of high dose vitamin B1. And I add this as just another thing that sometimes has to be considered if you're really struggling and have been for a while with chronic gut issues. If you look at Elliot Overton's work, if you look at some of the comments on the interview that I did with him, and I'll share a link to that interview again in the notes below, some people's lives have been utterly transformed by going down that approach when they've tried a lot of the typical protocols like we've been discussing here today. So I'm going to share, they're sort of 60, 90 seconds long. They're there just to give you a little bit of a sense of what else sometimes do we need to consider if what we've been considering today hasn't led to a resolution in your gut symptoms. I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. If you've enjoyed it, give it a like. It all helps kind of, spread the message, so to speak. And thank you for listening.
A portion of the patients that practitioners see, and the people who I personally saw whose gut problems, they appear to present in the gut, as in all of the manifestations of the person's problems are within the enterical digestive nervous system, but that was never the cause. That is merely a symptom of an underlying systemic problem. And just by focusing on gut, so gut responsive therapies, for instance, probiotics, dealing with gut infections, L-glutamine, fixing leaky gut, you know all the protocols, right? For those people, there's a lot of people who might get mild symptom benefit, but it does not fix their problem. And the reason for that is because that is not the root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem is actually a higher level mechanism, most often based in the brain, based in the peripheral, connecting to the autonomic nervous system in the gut. And the issue is they are not getting the correct signals from the brain through the vagus nerve to tell the digestive organs what to do. And so the digestive system as a whole simply is just responding to what it's getting from the brain, which is mixed signals. So I think that that is one of the things that is super common and is really missed by a lot of people.
Yeah.
Classically, this is what gives rise to people thinking SIBO is really difficult to deal with. It's not difficult to deal with. It's impossible to deal with if there is insufficient investment in the gut, because now there's no possible means through which we can elicit the conditions needed to respond to an anti-SIBO protocol.